Welcome, squirrels. In The Man Who Planted Trees, French writer Jean Genot illustrates the beautiful work of a fictitious shepherd in the hills near Provence, France. The narrator, a young man, is hiking alone in a desolate valley, out of water, and finding none, he is saved by the shepherd who offers him shelter. The narrator learns that this shepherd has, for years, been planting acorns and beech and birch saplings every day in his wanderings. The narrator returns, first after the First World War, to find young saplings have thrived in the valley, and now there are streams and wildlife. Over many years and decades, he visits the valley the shepherd has planted and finds it quite transformed into a settled paradise, the inhabitants of which are ignorant to the selfless act of creation by the shepherd. At the end of this treasure of a book, he writes, "When I reflect that one man, armed only with his own physical and moral resources, was able to cause this land of Canaan to spring from the wasteland, I am convinced that in spite of everything, humanity is admirable. But when I compute the unfailing greatness of spirit and the tenacity of benevolence that it must have taken to achieve this result, I am taken with an immense respect for that old and unlearned peasant who was able to complete a work worthy of God." Squirrels, today we begin with an ending, and we will end with a beginning. My guests today, the wonderful and amicable Andy Dibben and Ben Raskin, authors of the new book, SilvoHorticulture, will be inspiring us to participate in the great art of welcoming trees into our cropping systems. The planting of trees that will continue to bestow generations to come with gifts unnumbered feels like the perfect last episode, doesn't it? Let's get inspired, shall we?
Today's episode of the No-Till Market Garden Podcast is brought to you by Farmhand. I don't know about you, but I got into farming to grow food, not spend my time creating pack lists, writing newsletters, responding to emails, or maintaining web stores. If I could spend less time on my phone and computer and more time farming, that would be a win. Enter Farmhand. Farmhand is the only all-in-one virtual assistant built by and for CSA farmers. It takes care of the admin, managing orders, customer communications, and automating tedious tasks so you can get back to doing what you love. On average, Farmhand saves CSA farmers 6 hours a week. That's 6 hours you could spend with your family, out in the field, or simply taking a breather. So, what would you do with an extra 6 hours? Now's the time to get your systems ready for next season. Learn how Farmhand can help at farmhand.partners/no-till. All right, enjoy the show.
Ben, Andy, welcome to the podcast. Very excited to speak with you both today, and congratulations on the book. I understand it's coming out in January.
Indeed. Thanks for having us on. Sorry, Andy, interrupting you already.
Yeah. Well, don't worry about it. I'll try to prompt each one of you so that we don't overlap too much. But it's always fun to have more than one person so that we can kind of bounce back and forth. So the book, which I definitely want to get into, is a very timely, practical guide to silvohorticulture. And before we get into that, which we will spend most of our time on, it would be great if you both, and Andy, we'll start with you, could share us a little bit about your background and how you came to know each other, and then we'll switch to Ben, and then we'll get to how this book came about.
I'm not from a farming family or anything like that. I came into farming in my sort of mid-20s. Interestingly, and it links back to the book, my first sort of rural work, really, having grown up in the countryside, was actually managing woodlands, doing coppicing, making traditional charcoal, laying hedges, sort of tree-based work, really. And then I had a couple of kids, and kids are expensive, and woodland work in this country doesn't earn much money. So I went into livestock, and I did a bit of livestock farming. And then actually how I met Ben was I got into veg farming, and right at the beginning of my journey, or very early on, I ended up working on a farm, on a sort of community farm, CSA it was, being set up by Ben. And Ben was the first like really professional grower that I worked under, who gave me a bit of a sort of turbo apprenticeship in organic growing anyway. And we've been friends ever since, actually. And our first friendship was born through veg, and our second friendship was born through agroforestry. So yeah, the rest is kind of history. Yeah.
Lovely. And how about you, Ben? What were you always in farming, and also tell us a little bit about the farm and where you are, et cetera.
So yeah, like Andy, I'm not from a farming background. My parents were lawyers. My mum was a judge. I knew what I didn't want to do in life, but I didn't know what I did want to do. So I worked in catering, and I did a degree in ancient history, and I spent a couple of years busking in Europe, and ended up working on a vineyard in North Italy. I know you're into your vines as well, but yeah, so working on organic vineyard, helping with the picking and the bottling and stuff, and just fell in love with being outside and physical exercise and all of that. So that was around 30 years ago. And then I sort of came back to the UK and did a gardening course, and then various jobs. Always wanted to work in food. So got various jobs running wall gardens and market gardens and things. And then around 18 years ago, I had been looking to move back down to the southwest of England, which is where I'm from, and set my own garden up. So I'd always worked for other people. So I thought I'd come back down to the southwest, find some land. Took a temporary job at the Soil Association for a couple of years on a short-term contract, and I'm still there 18 years later. But worked part-time at the Soil Association, and then alongside that, try and do other practical farming stuff, which is how I met Andy at the community farm. And at the moment, and for the last 8 years or so, my practical work has been working on a agroforestry, pioneering agroforestry system, again in the southwest of England, a 1,500 acre farm where we're implementing a whole range of different agroforestry type systems, mostly not horticultural actually, but yeah.
Is that the Abbey farm?
No, so Abbey Home Farm is Andy's.
Okay.
The one I'm working on is Eastbrook Farm, which is owned by Helen Browning, who's also the chief exec of the Soil Association.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Interesting. This is all very fascinating. So when did you both decide that you should write this book together? It's hard enough to, work with other people, but to write a book with another person, that's another thing entirely. So how did the book be born?
Well, I
can't even quite remember, Andy. Can you?
I can remember exactly, Ben. It was on an absolutely terrible rainy drive to Devon. We were going to an agroforestry event in Devon. I just finished setting up the system here at Abbey Home Farm, which is it's not my farm, so I'm employed as head grower. But yeah, on that drive, Ben had already started. You were quite a few years into your system, I think, like 3 or 4. I was about a year or 2 years into ours. And Ben is a man of ideas and action. And I think the idea for the book came up on the way down to Devon. It was about a 3-hour drive. On the way back, I think by the time you dropped me off, Ben, we had come up with the contents and the framework for a book, actually. Yeah.
And the nice thing about working with Andy, because you're right, it could have been tricky. It's the first book I've co-authored, but we have worked together before anyway, so we know that we get on. And actually, writing a book is relatively easy compared to farming together. And the other nice thing about working with Andy is you have a meeting, you go, right, well, you do that chapter and I'll do this chapter. And so a week later, I'm sort of still getting my head together around mine. He goes, oh yeah, I finished that one. I started working on the next one. So you sort of turn your back and he's half written the book for you. So it's been great.
Amazing. Well, to get into the book, and there's so much that I'd love to get into, but people should read it, and we don't want to spoil their journey with the book. But I feel like it would be good to sort of set up how this book answers some questions that, at least in my opinion, are largely unanswered by the body of literature and resources that are out there about agroforestry, which is kind of its own discipline. And this is specifically about SilvoHorticulture, which is it's such a gift, because I think we'll get in first to the why for SilvoHorticulture, but then I want to get into the differences between those two systems. And so maybe, Ben, would you speak to how you view the needs that you are trying to fulfill with this book in particular?
It's really hard finding out specific information particularly about tree and crop combinations and interactions. And I work more widely with agroforestry. So a lot of the work that I do is in livestock systems, and it's all relatively straightforward. The benefits are fairly obvious, and you can find a fair amount of information. But when we start looking at horticulture, there's so much variation that it's really hard to say, well, actually, for what I want to do in this situation with these crops, how should I set it out, and what should I be aware of? And it's we both knew, so that and there's a grower called Alan Schofield who the book's dedicated to, who ran he accidentally ran it in the sense that he bought a holding that happened to have this system set up on it, but he ran it for 30 years, which was a pollarded alder rotational agroforestry system. And I just remember being blown away by how complex his thinking and rotation was, but also slightly overwhelmed by it then when I tried to develop my own systems, and trying to find that information, other than ringing Alan up and going, how did you do it? Was tough, I guess. And so, and I think Andy felt the same when he was setting his up. And so we felt, even though there's still not enough information out there, and there's still actually lots of research that needs to be done, at least we can sort of make a start of pulling together our own experience, some other growers, and what it does exist in terms of literature and science out there.
And Andy, was it similar for you? Where I do feel like a lot of farming books get written because you feel like you went through something, or you had questions that you wanted to answer yourself, and therefore you try to make a conscientious effort to share that knowledge that you learn along the way, as opposed to just have it be only for you and lost to the world otherwise.
Yeah, 100%. I think on the journey with agroforestry for myself, there was very little. There's about 2 people I could access for knowledge, and a couple of farms that I'd done good research setting up. One was Wakelins, and then Ben, who I knew well, I had 2 really good friends who are growers or have been growers, who kept nudging me to put in an agroforestry system, and eventually we did it. But there was desperately little information. A lot of the information I suppose I accessed was from silvopastoral systems and from silvoarable systems. And I suppose the key difference, like Ben alluded to with the livestock stuff, is the one thing about an annual cropping system is it's so dynamic. The scale of horticulture that I do, there is, I was writing a presentation just earlier, and I think in one field there's 8 different crop families. There are 30 different crop species. And that's just a static view of the field. Through the season, there's even more of both. So there are so many more variables in a horticultural system, and that was it makes it incredibly dynamic. Very compared to an arable system or a livestock system, it makes it much more dynamic in one moment in time, or let alone through a whole 12 months of a year. So it was one of those things that once, I knew all that before we started the book, and then we started researching for the book. It was unbelievable how much more dynamic it was than I'd ever thought, actually. And so I suppose saving people or providing people with more information than we had access, or I had access to when we set up our own system. And on a personal level, I hadn't written more than a sheet of paper since school, basically. So Ben he's like, it's great, you should write a book, it's brilliant. Ben's written a few other books, and life's short. Pack as much in as possible. So that was another major reason as well. Yeah.
Build the pie higher. That's my motto. So on that note, could we get into a little bit of the why? Because I think, most of our listeners are in that very dynamic annual cropping system, market gardeners, and they have tremendous wealth of knowledge of what plants go with what and how to turn beds well and what cover crops to use. And yet this is slow to, it's slow to come on with other horticultural systems. And part of that, I think, is just how little information is out there, but also really being able to understand what you gain by doing that. And so if you would both speak to what you believe the key benefits can be to a silvohorticultural system that is very dynamic, and why people would want to consider adding this layer to their already existing systems, or building it, ideally into a system before you even get started. Ben, why don't you start?
So for me, and then the reason I think I sort of became passionate about agroforestry, and actually most of my work now is on agroforestry rather than on horticulture, although obviously this is where the two worlds cross, is it's the natural extension of that diversity of an organic system. And, I'd been banging on in annual cropping about diversity and rotations, and, monocultures are bad and diversity is good, but hadn't made that step up to, well, hang on, in nature, there's trees as well. And I think I'd always had trees in the garden. If it was a walled garden, I'd had trees around the edges, or I'd planted rows of apple trees. Actually, at the community farm, we planted a couple of rows of apple trees, didn't we, Andy? But we planted them just along the track. We didn't think at the time, I don't think, to go, well, actually, we could put them all the way across. Why wouldn't you? And so there's then also there's a little bit of a fear, I think, or an uncertainty about what they're going to do if you stick them in the middle of your cropping, and it's going to make life more difficult, and you've got to set the system up that still works efficiently. And obviously there's smaller home scale forest garden type situations where you don't need to be mechanized and efficient, but actually for most commercial farms you've still got to drive your tractors around, or whatever machinery you're using. So how do you set it up? And then you're losing potentially good growing land for a few years while they establish, so you might be getting some of that cost. So there's a lot of, it's in terms of sort of what made me shift. I think there were the sort of inertia of a system that's mostly working, and you go, well, okay, it's sort of fine, and there might be some benefits, but it's a bit tough, even though I understand it. So it was really pushing on the diversity, I think, and understanding that diverse systems are always more productive. And how do we then harness that productivity for the business or for the farm? And I think I'd made that sort of psychological leap before the reality of climate change really hit. But everything that's happened since just reinforces that it's obvious in a way, and it's the right way to go. And I mean, Andy will talk very eloquently about that, particularly sort of in relation to his farm. But all of the benefits that we talk about, the shade, the shelter, the biodiversity, and all of that sort of thing, they're all, to me, are about building climate change resilience, really. So,
how about you, Andy? Anything to add to that? I'm sure.
Yeah, there's a couple of things. Yeah, I mean, one. So I suppose the first thing is, in horticulture, there's sort of two sides to this. The one side, a lot of the farm or veg farming I've been doing to start with had been very two-dimensional. So it's all on one plane, normally kind of below waist height across the field. To start with in horticulture, for me, it was very much one bed, one kind of crop in that bed. Then the better I got at horticulture, I realized that you could stack crops. So whether that be growing, and I think in some ways it's very interesting, like on our journey, it became clear that actually horticulturalists are probably best placed to take up agroforestry. We're already in the business of growing lots of different plants, adding in new plants and managing those plants, compared to a livestock farmer is actually probably a lot easier for a horticulturalist. And if you're an arable farmer, you generally grow like one or two or three kinds of grasses across your whole farm in huge wide areas. So it's actually an innate natural talent to most horticulturalists to add in new crops to a system. It's also, as I became, the more I got into horticulture, the better I became at it, I started using a lot of cover crops. Almost so many of my vegetable crops are undersown with cover crops. And so on a micro level, I was already kind of understanding the interaction between one plant and another plant in vertical levels, around roots interacting, around fertility interactions, around light interactions, all these things. And actually, in many ways, SilvoHorticulture is taking a step back and like just zooming out a bit. And it's the same interactions, but with bigger plants, definitely. Specifically on the farm where I work, the first reason we put in a SilvoHorticultural system, started planning within 2 years of me moving to the farm where I now work. So I've been here 10 years. So it'd been like 8 years ago. And that one of my main sort of production areas was incredibly windy. There's 2 wind turbines in the field, which kind of demonstrate how windy it is. And that was for me the very first desire to put the trees in. And I would say this was pre the ramping up of climate change. We knew it was coming. There was the first signs of it, but nothing like what's happening now across the world, but especially in the UK. And interestingly, my employer, who'd been running the farm for 30 years, we were buying a lot of apples. She wanted to grow lots of apples. So rather than putting an orchard somewhere else, I wanted to reduce wind speeds. She wanted new crop lines to sell in the farm shop at the farm where we work. And that just kind of, as well as having 2 good friends pushing me towards it, it all kind of just came to a head. And there seemed to be lots of solutions to be ticked off. And the idea didn't seem so crazy because of my already kind of meddling a lot with 3-dimensional cropping.
One thing that I really appreciate in the book is that case study from the Abbey Home Farm, because I can't express enough what it means to share somebody else's learned experience and not have to struggle through that yourself, because some things don't work. And it would be great if both of you could speak to some of the things that maybe you learned the hard way or the hardest way that were part of the reason for the book. And you divide the book into very logical chapters, and I really don't want to give too much away, but the climate change plays a big role in how to build a resilient system because you know what you're up against. But I think that a lot of the chapters that you've divided it into are actually the considerations that people should be thinking about, as opposed to maybe trying to think, oh, I want to grow this particular type of tree. Maybe that's not suitable for my existing system. Give us a sense of the thought process and how those learned lessons really led to the way that you set the book up, and the key things that people should really be thinking about in a decision matrix, as opposed to just, oh, it'd be fun to have.
I mean, I think the phrase we use in the book, Mimi, is objective setting. So I suppose the first thing is to be aware of what you can achieve by introducing trees into a horticultural system. And then it's a system of prioritizing which of those things, we always talk about it as being, SilvoHorticulture as being a toolkit, and it's selecting which tools out of a very diverse toolkit will serve you best as a grower. So that, and I always say this, I'm really passionate about this, is I think there can be a habit of going, oh, I'm going to do the system like, Jack Jones down the road did his system. And I think that is a very, you're missing an opportunity if you take that approach. I think if you really look at your farm or even individual fields, or even go smaller, individual parts of fields as completely unique entities, and they'll all have problems that need solving, which trees can help with, or they'll have opportunities that you can exploit with trees. And I think that's that's really, really important. So I think it's just such a huge opportunity to make positive impacts on a growing system, either one that you already have or one that you're planning on putting in. But you need to identify the potential and understand the options that trees can bring. But I mean, the second part of the question. So interestingly, the lessons. I wish I'd written the book before I planted that system. I learned so much researching the book that would have changed the way I put in that system. But we'll put in more trees at the farm, so I'll get to put in, apply that new knowledge. But I would emphasize that, really use it as a unique opportunity for your own particular circumstances.
How about you, Ben?
Well, I like sharing mistakes because I learn so much from, either sort of accidents that work or things that go wrong. And I think, once you've set your objectives, as Andy said, you're then faced with a choice still of trees. And for a lot of horticulturalists, fruit and nut trees are an obvious choice because we tend to be selling vegetables, and so why not sell some fruit and nuts alongside that? But being aware of the differences in trees, I guess, is such a key part of making that decision. And as an example, a lot of the prunus species sucker and have quite vigorous rooting systems. And so that can make it really tricky when you're trying to incorporate them into a vegetable growing system. That doesn't mean you can't. There's still ways of dealing with that and controlling it. But in a lot of cases, you might go, do you know what? I'm not going to put them in the middle because actually they're just going to cause me problems. So that's one example. But then even subtler differences, perhaps. So in one of the fields at Eastbrook Farm, we're growing apricots and almonds, and I've interplanted them with gooseberries and raspberries. And again, I hadn't really sort of because I don't think anyone else was doing it. I had no guidebook that says these soft fruits work well with these other fruit, big trees. So it was all a bit random. But what I found was that apricot trees have really dense, thick leaves, and they have quite a spreading habit. As a result, almost nothing survives underneath them. So interplanting them with gooseberries, I've ended up with some really weedy little plants that have done absolutely nothing. Whereas the almond trees are much more upright. They've got a finer leaf, so they actually let quite a bit of light through. And as a result, the fruit bushes under them have done really well, mostly, and thrive. So it's that kind of observing the habit of trees, or again, if you're going to plant apples, really thinking about the rootstocks and how that's going to react and how big that tree is going to be, not just year 3, but also year 10 and year 20, and understanding that time over change over time even.
Yeah, I really appreciated that, some of those discussions in the book, because especially with fruit trees and nut trees now, everything's on rootstock. And so being mindful of those rootstocks and their, how it's going to affect the habit of whatever you're growing on top. I also am really curious your thoughts on the differences between putting trees into a vegetable cropping system versus a perennial cropping system, like perennial berries or caneberries or grapes or whatever, or arable farming, where you're or even silvopasture, where I've noticed really, it's much more straightforward, where you can see the benefits of having trees added into an animal livestock operation, because it's not just about the additional shade and places for animals to get access to minerals that they aren't getting from, a more shallow rooting plant, but also how much more productive the forage becomes. And so that part has always been pretty obvious to me. But in terms of adding trees to other systems, there's so much to consider in terms of the design and the access that you need to have for harvesting certain crops and things like that. So again, if you would just touch on some of the key lessons that you've learned in terms of the design for the particular systems that you're working in now, because as I understand it, Andy, you're still doing more of a direct to market kind of market garden situation, and Ben, you're more in the silvopasture, it sounds like, and also with some perennials. So just offering some key insights from those two different systems and how the trees, because I can imagine just getting completely overwhelmed by, and I've been super experimental with this and a lot of things haven't worked and been total nightmares, but it's also been really interesting to see what has worked and even some coniferous trees being good choices for certain systems. So sorry, that was a long-winded and convoluted question, but I think you get the gist of what I'm asking. And Ben, why don't we start with you?
Yeah. So I think, so for me, because we don't have any annual cropping really at Eastbrook, we've got one very experimental field where we're trialing. That's where we've got the almonds and the apricots. And again, almonds in England are not very common anyway.
That was a wild card. Was not expecting that.
Especially not the heavy clay that I've planted them into, but amazingly, some of them have survived. So yeah, we're keen to try new stuff, and part of that is the climate change resilience bit again. So not just making the system resilient, but trying. It might well be that what we're used to growing isn't going to work, and we need to look at other stuff. So sort of in a way, pushing those boundaries all the time, but also. Understanding how they perform and understanding the benefit is not always easy. And the more diverse your system is, the harder it is, I think, to really, certainly to quantify the benefits. So I often get, when we're sort of talking to people, I often get asked to prove that such and such is going to be more productive, or, what should I do? What do you know that works? I don't know what works. I know what doesn't work sometimes. But is the shade that these trees are giving an advantage or not? Well, in some years it's going to be an advantage. In other years it might not be. And then because we've got a rotation, particularly when you start getting the annual crops, you go, well, how do I even work out whether the trees are beneficial or not? And sometimes the things that you think are going to work aren't. So one of the rows we've got quince trees, which I interplanted with sea buckthorn, thinking that was going to be my smaller interplant, and the quinces have done really badly, and the sea buckthorn about 3 meters tall. And so I didn't expect that to happen. And now we're thinking, but also then things crop up that you didn't expect. So we had intended to harvest the berries, which we are doing, and again making sort of products from them. But I hadn't realised that there was a market in herbal teas for the leaf. So we're now discussing with a herbal tea manufacturer to try and dry the leaf. So some of these things where you end up with plants which actually might have benefits way beyond what you'd originally planned. And as soon as you've got them and you start talking about them, people go, oh yeah, can I buy some of that? So that was really interesting to me as well. And I guess just being really open to everything and try and observing as much as you can. And I suspect I'm a little bit of a typical farmer in that I'm not very good at recording detail. I'm not a diligent record keeper. We do have a system that we try and use with tags on some of the trees and sort of automatic data collection, but you still got to put in the legwork. But I'd really, if the more that people are putting these systems in, the more that we can record, and just even anecdotal evidence is really useful as to sort of what works in certain situations. In heavy clay, actually, almonds might well survive in heavy clay as long as they don't sit too wet, and that's surprising to people. And certainly, watering them is not an issue that I have. Bit of sun to ripen them is more of a challenge. But
Andy, can you offer some experiential insight in your design and what you've learned kind of along the way, especially about where to put the trees and how those rooting systems can either be beneficial or maybe not, depending on, what you're trying to accomplish. It's, as Ben said, there's a lot to consider. And I do think people have to go into this with an open mind and a spirit of experiment. But we want people to do it. And so, especially if you've had great success with particular things or the way you've designed certain things now, or if you wish you had, that those would be great to know.
I think I would immediately follow on from what Ben said about prunus species. I mean, this is one that comes up quite a lot. And although I already knew it, I went boldly in and made the same mistake as many other people did. And in fact, I did it in a much more accelerated way because we put prunus inside a glass house and planted. I mean, it's brought some benefits, but in 1 year after planting, they'd gone, 5 meters, the roots, out into the cropping area. And I was like, we're going to need to root prune these at some point. I knew that when we planted them. I didn't realize we were going to have to do it immediately from the word go. But obviously in a glasshouse setting, everything happens a lot quicker and a lot more vigorously. So we thought we were fan training peaches. We thought they were peaches. They turned out to be nectarines because the nursery made a mistake. So there's another lesson. But we love nectarines as well. So that's all right. So, but we thought we weren't going to get, we were fan training. The book says you won't get anything till year 5. We got nectarines in year 3 because they grew so vigorously. So that was a positive. But at the same time, I thought I wasn't going to have to root prune until year 2 or year 3. And we saw negative impacts on surrounding crops within the first year. So I think a huge part of lessons learned is attending to root management. Definitely. We had, because I got lots of different alley widths, and lots of different lots of different little systems in different places. One of them, and again, we had a few cherries next to an asparagus plot. So a perennial plot that had been in there for 5 years. We planted the trees. The trees were there for another 3 years. And I think like all true good organic asparagus plots essentially succumb to weeds. Like a lot of organic perennials, weeds are often what make them not a true perennial. So in the end, we ended up cultivating that, bringing it out of asparagus. But it was a really good case study because we'd had these cherries in there and we'd done no tillage at all because it was an asparagus bed. And again, it was a really good lesson. You could see absolutely clearly how far these prunus roots had gone out into the asparagus beds, basically. We hadn't noticed any negative impact, but having seen how far the roots were going, I think I'd put a lot of the negative impact down to weed burden at the edge of the patch. But in hindsight, having then cultivated it and seen the rooting systems. So yeah, I think that would be definitely lessons learned, definitely. As far as as we've gone through it, I mean, what I always say is like kind of one of my catchphrases on the subject is, I definitely, when we put the system in, I thought it was going to, I put it in with the full intention that this system was going to increase my yields. And then with what's happened with climate change in the last 8 years, and here in the UK, that has, ramped up beyond. I always knew it was coming. I'm absolutely convinced it was coming, and it has come 5 times quicker than I thought it was going to come. And with the weather events we've had here in the UK in the last 2 years have been almost unnegotiable as a farmer. So I now don't say I'm trying to increase my yields. I say I'm trying to maintain my yields in the face of climate change, which, in a way is increasing them.
Flat is the new black. I say that all the time. Yeah.
So, and then I suppose the other thing is these things take time. As far for an agroforestry system, 8 years in, or 8 years since we designed it, so 6-7ish years now from planting. Things take time. Trees don't grow like lettuces. It's to see the benefits of them take a long time. We're starting to crop good amounts of apples, but we're a long way off top yields. But then some things happen quickly. So both the trees, but just as important, I see it just as an important part of the system as the understory to the trees, which we put in on one of our systems is perennial wildflowers. And that's all about predatory insect habitats to essentially protect. We're organic farmers, so our only pesticides is other insects, predatory insects. And that's just been absolutely mind-blowing. We already do lots of other stuff, but having these lines of permanent perennial habitats right through the cropping areas, right out in the middle of the fields, without a doubt, you walk across those fields on a nice still summer's evening, and they're just humming with predators, absolutely humming. And we've seen the direct, massively beneficial results on the crops. Our aphid control and caterpillar control since putting in these I could just, rather than silver, these habitat strips right in amongst the crops has just been absolutely, it's just really plain for the eye to see. So, nature comes quick when you give it a space. So, yeah. And it has to be perennial, because you've got all the stages of life. It's not just the ones that fly about in the summer. If they can overwinter in their different stages right in the middle of the field, they're far more effective.
I want to get into some technicalities, because one of the things that I think is very well done in your book is talking about this misconception that people have about trees, which is you can put them into an annual system because their roots go deep, deep, deep. And in reality, we know you can see it when you just walk around a park. Most tree roots are horizontal and big, significant root systems. And you spend a good amount of time talking about that reality, as well as how that impacts phasing. And obviously there's one way of doing things where now you have an existing farm and now you want to incorporate trees into it, and you would do things one way. But if you were planning a new system and really had the advantages that this book can afford, will you please talk a little bit about what it means to set up a system? And it doesn't have to be your system. It could be just a hypothetical one. But again, talking about root management, bed placement, other shrub or perennial placement, and just the reality of root interaction, because it can be positive, but it's not going to be without maintenance. And I think that's one of the things you are really trying to get across to people, is that this foresight is helpful if you can manage it. So, Ben, do you want to start and speak to that misconception and also just how those things need to be managed, or if there are trees that are more suitable to certain systems that you've found that are not just the above ground habit, but the below ground habit?
Yeah, so that, and I definitely fell into that camp of imagining a tree root as almost a heart shaped, where you've got a tap root and you've got a bit of stuff at the surface, but sort of mirroring what you see above is below. And then you start to look at it, and something like 80% of trees have all of their roots within the top 2 foot of soil. So you quite quickly think, well, that's definitely going to have an impact on the size of tree that I want in my system. So I think, and in a way, that shouldn't be surprising, because you would never plant cabbages under big oak tree, would you? You know that it's not going to grow. So the combination of the roots and also the shade means that there's a size and height of tree that makes sense depending on your system. And again, it comes down, as we were talking before, about the objectives. So if timber is your objective and you want big timber trees, then you have to design a system that's got wide enough alleys that it's not going to impact the crop. If the vegetables are your main priority and the trees are there to support them, then you're going to choose something probably smaller. So it goes back a little bit to that. And there's a couple of calculations, equations, in terms of sort of height versus width, and the sort of that makes sense to make sure you get enough light, and then you're also getting the maximum benefit of the shelter. So there's sort of minimum and maximum distances between rows that you can work out depending on how tall you want your tree to be. Or the other big bit of this, certainly if you're mechanized, is designing it around your kit. There's no point having a 10-meter spacing if your machinery is 6 meters wide, because you'll only be able to do a row and a half. So that kind of thinking about all of the practicalities when you're designing it. But the other big bit then, as well as the potential size of the tree, is how can you control the size of the tree? And pruning not only removes the top of the tree, but also a similar proportion of the root will die off when you cut the top off. So keeping the top of a tree small will also keep its roots small, which is why coppice systems work really well. Willow can be a bit over vigorous sometimes, but certainly things like hazel, are brilliant. And I'm really into the idea of coppicing apples and pears. There's no reason why you can't. Anything deciduous, pretty much, you can coppice, and it makes pruning easier. The other opportunity, which we do explore a little bit, and I didn't mention in my introduction, but I did set up a small agroforestry system on some rented land, and the landlord went bust, and I had to rip all the trees out, and it was all very sad. But but those trees I designed as 8-foot tall trellis trained fruit trees. So the idea was that they would be managed very intensively. So there's a lot of evidence that says those systems are very productive. They're more labor intensive, but they're very productive. But also you're keeping those trees at a known height and a known width. And so you can really maximize that production space in between. So basically, anything is possible really, but you've got to understand what tools you have, what you want to get out of it, how much land you've got, and all of that stuff.
I'm sure you have much to offer on that as well, and I want to hear your thoughts. But if you would speak also to the root pruning, because I've done a lot of experimenting with root pruning, both of vines and of trees. And to some degree, you really can affect their growth habit underground if you do it early enough and in combination with other things growing to sort of teach those roots where they need to go. What's your experience been? What tools do you like to use? How early do you think it needs to happen? Any insights there?
So I kind of alluded to that when I was talking about planting peaches that turn into nectarines in the glasshouse. And it's very it depends about when I started planting and started learning about root pruning, it was kind of the given that if you were doing any kind of field cultivations, that these would kind of do your root pruning for you. It was kind of the assumed position. Now, I think it's like all these things with nature. It's not a simple, straight answer. I think it depends on your soil type. If you've got deep, friable soil, those roots are going to colonize it and go further. I farm on 15 centimeters of topsoil, and then I'm into rocks, which I think in itself limits the root growth anyway. And we have two ways of root pruning we're planning on doing our root pruning on the farm. One is, so in the glasshouse, we don't use any machinery. We've got a little 2-wheel tractor we occasionally use, but that only goes down to we only really till it 5 centimeters with that, I suppose. So actually in the glasshouse, we just do it with a spade. We dig it out, and we'll dig it out properly once a rotation. So once every 5 years, we're going to properly dig it out. And then actually we just slide a spade straight down into the ground on either side of these fan-trained trees. And I suppose it's hard describing with words, but keeping the roots quite two-dimensional. So they're almost mirroring underneath the fan of these nectarine trees and trying to keep them out the cropping areas. And so far, that's had very little impact on the vigor of the trees at all. Like the tree seems to be as vigorous, if not more vigorous, as it gets older than with that form of root pruning. In the book, we talk about there's obviously a huge movement to reducing tillage. Whatever kind of farming you're doing, even if you are tilling, you're trying to reduce it. But in market gardening, there's a huge movement of zero tillage in no dig. And in the book, we talk about if you're doing that, if you're putting, and I said with the asparagus beds we have, I think if you're planning to put trees into a no dig system, I think the way I would do that system is with a barrier. So when I planted the trees, I'd want to put a barrier in either side to keep those. And I think the depth is the other key question. So on my field scale, I plow to a maximum 15, but we try and keep it to between 10 and 15 centimeters deep. And that kind of keeps most roots okay. Prunus is where the problem lies again. And I know other farms in the country with more established systems, it's cherries that have caused quite big negative impacts on nearby crops, even with a shallow ploughing regime. So I think there will have to be some further research and work done on larger scales. How you're going to keep these tree roots away from your vegetables? I mean, whether that's with a subsoiler or whether that's with some specially developed kit. Farmers are resourceful people. We all know welders and engineers. So I don't think it's a problem. I think it's a under talked about aspect that needs to be. But my understanding is, talking to sort of arboriculturalists and tree experts and forestry experts, is that if you repeat the root pruning for a certain amount of time, the tree gets used to it and kind of gives up trying to put roots into that area. It's something that comes out of urban tree planning quite a lot, that if the tree roots can't grow into the foundations of a building, they can't get into them, they stop trying and they grow around them, they grow underneath them. Same with roads and things like that. So I think it might turn out to be, and again, there's a lot of research to be done. It might turn out that, maybe in the first 10 years, a really good, strong root pruning regime will perhaps have a permanent effect, is what I expect to see.
Yeah. And I think it comes down to what other resources do you have? Do you have irrigation? I don't know if that's an issue for you, but what I've found, because root pruning, I have found to be pretty effective if you repeat it over and over in a constantly tilled system with, maybe a 6-inch shank on, very close, trying to keep that verticality. But I've also found that if you can establish into a deep rooting perennial system right up to the edge of where you're putting the trees in, and if you can do a really good job with your establishment of just keeping the direction of where you want those, it takes longer to set it up, and you need to water them very deeply to encourage the direction and the depth of the roots. But if you can keep that fibrous root system right up next to the vertical nature of the tree roots, that can almost do the same thing as root pruning, but it takes such conscientious effort in the establishment phase. And one of the things I really love about your book is how you hammer that point, is just the critical nature of thinking about phasing things in and not underestimating what that's going to add to a period of time. The benefits are all going to be there, but you do have to be solid and determined, because these things, you do kind of have to learn them based on your resources, your system. So I just appreciate that. And do either of you have anything more to add on that?
Can I come in on that point? It's really interesting. So you talk about the phasing in and establishing of the system, right? And one of the things I came across from your research in the book, and I absolutely love this, and there's obviously the challenges of the roots as they get bigger, but there's the opportunities to be exploited at the beginning when they're not big. And one of the really, quite often you hear people talk about agroforestry as it's a new thing, and it's not. It's been around for thousands and thousands of years. And there's a system that was very common in the UK, in a county called Kent, where it's famous for its orchards, really famous for its fruit orchards. And it was a standard thing that they'd use, they'd use SilvoHorticulture when they were establishing a brand new orchard. And they'd put the lines of apple trees in at a good spacing. So when they were mature, they'd have good air movement around them and good light around the crops. But that meant in year one, when they planted them, you had these huge gaps between the lines of apple trees. And they exploited that by cropping annual vegetables right up to the apple trees. And this is sort of 100 years ago this was going on. And the same with the system that we put in, and we talk about in the book, is when you first put the trees in, you can crop veg right up next to them. But in your long-term plan, you just got to allow that understory tree row width is either you're going to have to be very proactive with root management, or you plan your system that row is going to get wider over, year 1 and 2. It might well be at sort of, I don't know, you might be at, I suppose on again, depending on root stock, but you might be at like 2 or 3 foot. But by year 10, you've gone out to kind of 5 foot, 6 foot, totally depending on the system the tree type you've put in and the system. But so it's that dynamic. It's not a static system that you plant all the same spacings in on year 1. You can kind of change the tree row width and the vegetable alley width over time as it establishes.
Coppicing and pollarding are not things that are very common in the States, but they're very, or at least historically very common in the UK and other parts of Europe. I know it's not particularly the topic, but would you both spend a little time talking about those two approaches and what people might be missing if they are just thinking about a harvestable apple or fruit to add to their system? What are the other ways that you can capitalize on having trees in your system that aren't necessarily fruits? They can be all those things, but just so people know what those things are, would you speak to what pollarding and coppicing are and what the benefits and possible product uses are of those things?
Yeah, absolutely. And well, Andy, I'm sure coming because he'd been a coppicer in his previous life. But coppicing effectively is where you cut the tree right down to the ground on a periodic basis, usually every 3, 5, 10 years, depending on how big you want the branches to be. And most deciduous trees you can coppice. Some respond better than others. It's used a lot for willow for biomass and feeding in as a biomass product. But pretty much any tree that you can think of. I mean, I came across a text which was talking about a 60-year rotation coppice for oak, which fed into the shipbuilding industry. So, so you can do almost anything. Pollarding is effectively the same process, but you leave a stem, you leave a sort of certain amount of trunk. And typically the historical reason for doing with that was that it allowed the regrowth to be away from deer or cattle that were going to browse it off, so it protects the regrowth. So that's sort of two ways of doing it potentially. And then in terms of the products, it's almost whatever you can get from a tree. I mean, I'm a big fan of wood chip, and any tree, any coppice tree, pretty much you can wood chip, and it's relatively low value, but it's a really useful product, particularly if you're planting more trees or trying to build soil health, that sort of thing. But equally, bean poles and pea sticks and fence posts, almost anything in a way. So, Andy, I'm sure you've got some other thoughts as well.
I mean, I would just say it was literally before all the things Ben mentioned, before someone invented metal wire in this country. It was an absolute, these coppice products. So essentially a tree you cut down and every 7 years you got back a piece of wood, somewhere between, depending on when you cut it and what the species was, you had a crop of wood that would end up about the thickness of your forearm. Has a whole world of uses, and fencing, as shepherds used to make all of their, what you'd now call a metal sheep hurdle. They were all made out of hazel, if you went back kind of 100 years. It'd be exactly the same with like post and rail fencing. That was all traditionally, a lot of it was made out of sweet chestnut. So chestnut fencing and oak as well. And I think there's a real match. Ben's talked about wood chip, and there's a big thing about in horticulture, everyone uses compost. A lot of people, not so many in organic now, but peat has been identified as a not healthy product to be used for making compost, but used to make the bulk of compost. It looks like wood chip's going to be the best replacement, one of the best replacements for that. And again, it's the twofold thing. It's the alternative source for these products. So alternative source for compost, alternative source for horticultural things like growing your beans up and stuff like that. But it's also the resilience of producing them on your own farm, So we talk about reducing, all of this, we talk about reducing inputs. So reducing the need to buy stuff into your farm. So that's resilience, but it's also saving money. If it's just growing there and you cut it down once every 7 years and you don't have to buy this fencing material in, or a big thing in horticulture is buying in bamboo That's what we all climb all our plants up. It's the absolute standard. And that's coming from the other side of the world. So there's all the fossil fuel implications for that as well. And the instability of supply chains with whether it be pandemics, whether it be climate change, whether it be war, whether it be economics, being in control of those inputs makes you more resilient to many things.
I love the reference to the chip, because I think for not just for homesteaders, but for anyone whose land is maybe slightly degraded or very degraded, maybe it's your first opportunity to buy land and you had to buy something that maybe wasn't in the greatest health. A huge advantage of SilvoHorticulture, in my opinion, working in a coppice system or a pollarded system, is that source of ongoing, just beautiful carbon that you can incorporate back into your soil and rehabilitate it over time. Because again, it's just bringing more energy into the system faster. And so the kinds of gains that we can make, and especially where I live in the Western United States, where not agricultural, but cultural burning used to be a major part of these systems and managed by indigenous people, that layer of carbon has been largely lost for the last several hundred years. And being able to replace that either with ramial wood chip or making your own biochar on the farm, it's so much less expensive, and it actually makes the system doubly healthier, because you're not just bringing in added photosynthetic nutrient, but you're also keeping that product on site. So I love that you mentioned that. And I want to be mindful of your time. You've been super generous speaking with us today already, but are there things that you really are excited about trying, or crops that you're excited about trying together, or things that you wish people would be excited to try on their own farms, ideas that you've had that maybe you haven't done on your own farm yet, but if you live somewhere else, you would try? I'm just curious what you're both excited about. Maybe we'll start with Ben.
So I get really excited about doing things that other people haven't done yet. I like being a bit experimental, even if it means it goes wrong quite a lot of the time. Hence things like almonds. So I'm really interested in trying more of the different nuts, particularly. I think there's starting to be people growing more nuts in the UK. Historically, we've done hazelnuts and cob nuts and, some walnuts, but not much else. And so I think that's really exciting. I'm also really interested in the potential for herb crops, and particularly for crops from trees. And again, we have a £1 billion herb import market in the UK, and it's all coming from China and India and wherever. And actually, we could grow a lot of them ourselves, and they could fit really well into a horticultural system. And because often you don't need huge amounts of them to be profitable, it's the processing and the adding value. So I think again, as Andy said, growers are used to having lots of different crop lines and doing lots of different things with them. So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff could happen there.
Andy?
It's something we kind of planned into the system, but with the system we put in at the farm, which goes back to what you said, Mimi, about a ramial wood chip. And I like everyone I know who uses ramial, and a big proponent in this country was Ian Tolhurst, who was the other person other than Ben that pushed me into getting an agroforestry system established. But everyone I know who does it, they cut wood chip over there, and they then bring it over here and put it in the field. We kind of factored it into our system, but we mucked around with how wide our tree alleys are. Sort of our tree rows are going to be in the field. And what I now know is I want to put a few more in, make the gaps between the tree rows narrower. But I have this lovely image in my head of just driving a chipper up the side of the field and firing it straight out over my cover crops at the beginning of a rotation, and designing whole systems that are designed like that. So the only fertility inputs in that system are the cover crop you're growing and the ramial you're firing out from one side. But it'd be interesting, you get into the world of like, okay, so what's the range of the chipper? and that becomes one of the, if I fire it from this side and I fire it from that side, where does this shower of wood chip meet up in the middle? And I love, everyone always says that a closed system is impossible. And I love a challenge. So I'm up for that one.
I love that.
Great to hear so much wood chip talk.
I know.
Allows me to plug my other book.
Yes, well, please do, because Ben, you've written more than one other book, right?
I have. This is my 8th book. It's very exciting.
Yeah. So Ben's got a lot of books.
My last one was the wood chip handbook. So yes,
and it's great. And there are so many uses for wood chips. I'm always just wishing I had more wood chips. And so there's no reason not to, at the very minimum, do a coppice system where you can just cut it all the way to the ground and get you some wood chips to use between your bed. I mean, there's no reason not to do this, in my opinion. And I'm so excited.
And it's flexible as well. With most of the species, if you don't get around to it one year or you forget whatever, then it's not going to grow so much that it's going to ruin the whole system. So it's a very adaptable and flexible resource.
Yes, kind of foolproof. You're not having to bring anything to the market, so to speak, other than your own benefits, soil, and et cetera. Okay, well, one last bit of appreciation is just for how thoughtfully put together the book is. I love the case study about the Abbey Home Farm and how well illustrated it is. I think it's so lovely to look at, and it really gets you thinking imaginatively about what your own system might look like. So, is there anything that you wish that I had asked that I didn't ask, or that you really would like to share with the listeners before we let you go?
Andy?
It's such a fascinating, we wrote the book to help other people design their own systems. And I feel like we just scratched the surface, especially about how permanent the system's been all over the world, and how actually, in the States and in Europe, we're kind of relearning it as a skill. But, look into the wider subject. There's only so much you can fit into a book. It's incredible what an absolutely everyday part of agriculture in other parts of the world it is. And the myriad of different ways the technique is used, depending on where you are, what the climate is, what the crop you're growing is, what your altitude is. It's a fascinating subject. It's one of those subjects, like horticulture itself. The more you learn, the bigger the subject becomes. It's just really enjoyable to learn about it.
Agree. Ben?
Yeah, I guess I almost feel that the sort of the second book or the next edition or whatever, we almost sort of need a list of every vegetable and how SilvoHorticulture might benefit it. So one of the examples I always used to use, which is one of the reasons my first system I designed, was butternut squash in this country is somewhat marginal. We don't always get a long enough, hot enough summer for it to do really well. So you might get a really good crop 1 or 2 years in 5, and then the other crops it doesn't do very much. But actually, if you could, you're 4 or 5 degrees warmer in the shelter of a tree, so immediately you've got slightly warmer conditions for it. And if you can then extend the season a little bit, because the ground warms up and dries out quicker and later, so you might end up with 8 weeks longer and 4 or 5 degrees warmer, and suddenly that crop becomes viable. Whereas something else, so Andy was talking about his leafy greens and about the fact that they might be growing really well, but if they've been shredded by the winds, you can't sell them. They might taste great, but they look rubbish and no one's going to buy them. So reducing the wind speed for that crop is actually really crucial and could potentially increase yields by 20% or whatever. So, but for every crop, there's this sort of particular set of needs and circumstances where a tree might benefit it. And obviously we couldn't fit all of that in. I haven't even thought about probably half the crops, but every time I think about it, it's like, oh yeah, you could do that for that crop. And again, the sort of the complexity of horticulture, as Andy says, is almost never ending, the sort of the need for some of that information. But yeah, that would be the sort of where I'd like to go next, I guess.
I totally agree. And I came away from reading your book feeling just like I wanted to try so many more things, which is an excellent feeling. And I do think, just to reiterate what you both have alluded to, is that in addition to how we can add water to our systems through building organic matter, trees buffer a system in the same way that water does. It's not just the shade protecting from heat. It's actually warmer, near a tree. And I think that that's something probably a lot of people don't, I mean, maybe they kind of know that, but they don't specifically know it. And it is true. Trees buffer a system. They buffer the systems of the world, and we're learning what it means to have removed most of them. So I think that that's an incredibly brilliant point. If you have one more second, I did forget one thing that I wanted to ask you both, which is, can you give a specific example of a climate change impact that your system has buffered you against? And the lettuce example was a good one. So if you don't have another one, that's fine. But if you have others, which I'm sure you do, those would be great to share.
I mean, the one I definitely say, I wish I could have got better photos of these. The nature of climate change is when you're dealing with carnage on your farm because you've had like torrential floods or winds. The last thing you have time to do is go and grab your camera.
Right. Let me get my camera.
Yeah. And we're actually, I never put this in as part, this was never designed as part of the system, but the slowing the movement of water across the land, and whether that is, we've had some torrential flooding in the last 2 years. Now, we're lucky. We're up on the hills, we flood, and then it drains quite quickly. But what I witnessed in our system, which is quite flat land, and the water, as it's moving sideways across the land in these catastrophic flooding events, for us, it doesn't cause too many problems. But you can see the water there's ever such a slight slope in our field, and you can see this water being held up at each tree row. So just uphill of each tree row, there's a puddle, And I think when I first saw it, I was like, oh no, there's a puddle there. But obviously what that has stopped is very quickly a lake forming in the bottom corner of that field. And if you extrapolate that out to society, if all the farms have tree rows across them, that's saving a city or a town downriver, and it's keeping the soil in the field, it's stopping the pollution of the rivers, it's stopping us losing the topsoil out to sea. So I love the potential I love the image of the whole of the farming landscape having 100 times more trees in it, and all of those buffering effects you talk about. Starting to see that happen over the next 60, 70 years,
Yeah. How about you, Ben?
Yeah, I don't know if I've got a specific example from our farm. I mean, I do definitely have experience of how the hydrology has changed. So as I say, we're not cropping mostly our land, so it's pasture. But there was one field which has a big dip in it that used to flood every year, and about, I think after the third year or the fourth year that we planted trees, it stopped flooding. So the trees were not big. They were probably only 6-7 foot tall. And then this was a bit of sort of woodland pasture. So it's quite densely planted as sort of 4 acres. But that field, which is called Withy Pump Field, so you can sort of guess quite how wet it might be. And it still gets wet, don't get me wrong, because it's flat and low-lying and heavy clay. But that dip that used to fill with water hasn't filled with water since, even in the torrential winter we had. So something's happening under there. Now that might be a problem. I mean, Andy was sort of talking about holding water up, whereas what would have sat in the surface is now infiltrating. But I think generally it's got to be a good thing. It's going through the soil. It's holding in the soil, and it's being cleaned. I mean, we're an organic farm, so we're not using much. But if you were using fertilizer and stuff, it would slow and clean that water as it was coming out. So there's a whole range of those benefits. And I mean, the other bit, just we touched on it earlier around the establishment, and one of the things, I mean, it's not, I guess, a benefit, it's more sort of how we've adapted our approach to tree planting. So and I touch on this in the wood chip book, but we've moved to a system now where we mulch really heavily when we plant, 25 centimeters, 9 inches or whatever, of mulch. And even in the years, and we often now get 2 or 3 months of no rain in the spring, which would have been unheard of mostly in the UK. But even where we've had that, we suffer almost no losses of trees now. And so we're almost trying to think of, in our ambition for tree planting, because we've got, again, it's a big farm, 1,500 acre farm. So we got an ambition to plant many thousands of trees, but we're, rather than sort of rushing into it all and go, yeah, let's plant 10,000 trees this year, when we can't plant them properly and look after them properly, we're almost limiting our tree planting to the amount of wood chip we've got, so that we can really plant them well, mulch them well, know that they're going to establish and be resilient, whether it's wet or dry or all of that. So it's that sort of thinking about the sustainable increase. And this, I don't know if it's the same in the States, but there's some really bad examples in the UK of community forests being planted or big scale planting. And, everyone gets very excited. They raise lots of money and, all the school children go out and plant them, and they don't plant them very well and they don't mulch them. They walk away, and a year later, 90% of them have died. And you've got to go back and actually, it's so easy to get around that with a bit of proper planning.
Yeah, durability to those projects. There are plenty of examples of them in the States, and restoration projects as well, where without thinking about the extra time you need to spend just right at the beginning, just the conscientious planning and limiting yourself to what you really have the bandwidth for makes all the difference in the durability and longevity of what you're doing. And so thank you for saying that. But also I want to sort of wrap up just by saying how much more beautiful these systems are to work in and what that means for everybody's day-to-day quality of life. So would either of you like to just say a word about that? Because it's kind of everything, farming can be really hard sometimes, and being in a beautiful place and being outside and being a little bit buffered from the extremes. Do you have anything to say about that?
I mean, I described the field where we put our agroforestry system in about May, when there's loads of apple blossom out, there's loads of cover crops in full flower. The perennial wildflower strips are just coming out into flower under the apple trees. It can literally look a bit like a Monet painting, and it's like working. It's like working in a piece of art. It's stunningly beautiful. It's just on a really simple human level. It's stunningly beautiful, and that's from the heart. That is.
Yes. How about you, Ben?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I agree entirely, and there's evidence that animals are happier when they're among trees, as well as humans. So I think, we've evolved, haven't we, to be in a tree landscape, and I think we all feel better with trees around. And there's even they emit volatile chemicals that have a positive impact on our mental state. So there's this physical stuff that's going on, as well as something that might be a bit kind of, oh, isn't it nice to be under a tree, which obviously it is, but there's demonstrable positive impacts on our well-being. So yeah, I'm all for that. There's quite interesting. One of the fields, the one with the almonds, actually is planted in curved lines. It's a flat field, so it's not a contour planting. And people always ask, like, oh, why have you planted it in not in straight lines? It's like, because Helen wanted it to look nice, and actually it can still be productive. It's, it's still, they're parallel, not straight lines. So we can still drive tractors up and down and do what we need to do. And actually, I quite like straight lines as well, but there's something really lovely about being in the middle of that field, which does feel more just natural and random.
Well, Ben, Andy, it has been so exciting to speak with you both. Congratulations again on your wonderful book. We will definitely link to it and make sure that people know how to find both of you and your other work. And just thank you for sharing your adventures with all of us and helping people get started on this journey without having to maybe stumble through some of the things that you had to. it takes a lot to get a book out there. And so it means a lot to everyone who's going to benefit from your making the time to share your experience. So thank you very much.
No, thanks very much for having us on. It's been it's been a lot of fun.
Thanks, Mimi. It's really nice to chat to someone who knows the subject so well themselves as well.
Thank you. I don't know about you, but listening to Andy and Ben talk about these transformations makes me feel like that scene from Mary Poppins where Dick Van Dyke is jumping into his chalk paintings and just creating these beautiful pictures of what our farms can look like. And personally, I'm inspired, very inspired. Now, in the Dalarna province of Sweden, there is a Norway spruce called Old Tajiko. Over millennia, Old Tajiko has generated trunk after trunk, weathering the onslaught of disturbance through time on roots that are over 9,500 years old. Friends, trees in our systems add exponentially more than their contributions of food, shade, stability, whatever. They are witnesses to our time on Earth and carry our stories as we carry theirs. I don't really believe in goodbyes, friends. We're a community, and we will remain so. I want to thank all the excellent and dedicated miracles who make this podcast front to back for who they are and how they live and the music they put out in the world. I want to thank you for listening and for the work that you do and how you show up for your community. And I want to thank the great Ken Kesey for writing Sometimes a Great Notion, in which he says, "Time overlaps itself. A breath breathed from a passing breeze is not the whole wind. Neither is it just the last of what is past and the first of what will come, but is more like a single point, plucked on a single strand of a vast spider web of winds, setting the whole scene a-tingle. That way, it overlaps. As prehistoric ferns grow from bathtub planters, as a shiny new axe taking a swing at somebody's next year's split-level pine wood pad bites all the way to the Civil War, as proposed highways break down through the stacked strata of centuries. Be well, friends. Treasure your time, and see you around.